The winter of 2026 has transformed from a seasonal challenge into an existential crisis for the Russian Federation, as the accumulated neglect of decades and the overwhelming demands of an unwinnable war converge to create a humanitarian disaster of staggering proportions. Across the vast expanse of the world's largest country, from the icebound ports of the Arctic to the industrial cities of the Urals and the far eastern reaches of the Pacific coast, hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens find themselves abandoned by a state that has poured its resources into conquest abroad while allowing the basic infrastructure of survival to crumble at home. The city of Murmansk, once the pride of Soviet Arctic development and a strategic stronghold for the Northern Fleet, has become the symbol of this collapse, as 73,000 residents endured 5 days without electricity or heat in late January, forced to huddle in libraries and emergency tents while temperatures plunge to levels that make exposure a matter of life and death. But Murmansk is only the most visible example of a nationwide catastrophe that has left an estimated 380,000 Russians without essential utilities during one of the most brutal winters in recent memory, a population abandoned by a Kremlin that has chosen weapons over warmth, invasion over infrastructure, and imperial ambition over the basic duty of governance. The scenes unfolding across Russia's cities would be recognizable to any resident of wartime Ukraine, except that in Russia there are no enemy bombs to blame. In Severomorsk, the headquarters of the Northern Fleet, city streets remained pitch black for days after power pylons collapsed under conditions that an official inquiry later revealed should never have been possible. The pylons, designed for a maximum service life of 40 years, had been in operation for 60, monuments to a Soviet past that Russia has repeatedly claimed to have surpassed but never actually replaced. Schools and daycare centers in Murmansk either shut down entirely or attempted to continue operations without lights during a season when the sun appears for only a few hours each day. Parents struggled to bathe children and prepare meals in apartments with no water and no power. The Russian army, the same institution that is consuming the bulk of the national budget to prosecute the war in Ukraine, was dispatched to set up heated tents and serve hot meals to its own citizens, a tacit admission that the state had failed in its most fundamental responsibility. The numbers tell a story of systematic neglect, compounded by wartime priorities. President Vladimir Putin told a government meeting that Russia needed to spend 4.5 trillion rubles, approximately $59 billion, on upgrading utilities by 2030. This figure was itself a drastic reduction from the official strategy his own government had recommended in 2022, and a 2024 report by the state-owned Sberbank indicated that improving heating systems alone would require several times even that reduced amount. But the promised funds have not reached the utilities. The federal budget allocated just 150 billion rubles, less than $2 billion, for infrastructure improvements last year, and an official report by the Russian Audit Chamber in December revealed that only 1/3 of that meager allocation had actually been disbursed. The money that might have prevented pipes from bursting and pylons from collapsing has instead been diverted to fund the production of tanks and shells, the payment of soldiers and their survivors, and the maintenance of an occupation that grows more costly with each passing month. The connection between the war and the suffering of civilians at home is not lost on the Russian people, even if fear prevents them from expressing their anger openly. Violeta Grudina, a former resident of Murmansk who fled to Lithuania after the invasion, described the city as feeling like a front-line community, enduring the same darkness and cold as Ukrainian cities under bombardment, but without the excuse of enemy action. The residents who spoke to state television cameras, huddled in libraries seeking warmth, did not blame the war directly, but their complaints carried an implicit accusation that the state had failed them. A woman sheltering in a Murmansk library told reporters that the situation was really bad, with no water and no power, making it impossible to shower, cook a meal, or bathe a child. Her words echoed those of countless Ukrainians who have endured similar conditions as a result of Russian missile strikes, a parallel that the Kremlin would prefer to go unnoticed, but that resonates deeply with those experiencing it. The infrastructure crisis is not limited to the Arctic. From the Murmansk region in the European north to the Pacific coast, a dozen major blackouts and central heating cutoffs have occurred since December alone, each leaving thousands of residents struggling to survive temperatures that regularly drop below -30 degrees Celsius. In the Siberian city of Omsk, residents blocked a road with their cars in an attempt to force local authorities to repair a central heating main that had been broken for more than 2 weeks. The protest, remarkable for its rarity in a country where even minor expressions of discontent risk severe punishment, resulted in fines for illegal gathering rather than any improvement in the heating situation. The message to Russians contemplating similar actions was clear: the state will enforce order even as it fails to provide warmth. The economic foundations of this collapse extend far beyond the utility sector. Russia, which once prided itself on its status as a gold-rich nation with reserves that provided stability and international confidence, is now watching its gold holdings dwindle at an alarming rate. At the beginning of 2022, the Central Bank of Russia held approximately 560 tons of gold in its reserves. Today, that figure has fallen to about 160 tons, a reduction of more than 300% in just 4 years. This is not the result of responsible asset management or strategic diversification. It is the consequence of a wartime economy burning through every available resource to sustain a conflict that consumes money faster than it can be generated. The gold that once backed the ruble and provided a cushion against economic shocks has been sold off to finance military operations, to pay soldiers and their families, and to purchase whatever goods and technologies can still be obtained through the narrowing channels of international trade. The gold mining industry itself, concentrated significantly in the Ural Mountains region, is on the verge of collapse. Enterprises that have extracted precious metal from Russian soil for generations now face bankruptcy as international sanctions close traditional sales channels and domestic buyers impose terms that make continued operation impossible. The Berezovsky mine in the Sverdlovsk region, one of the oldest and most storied gold operations in Russia, finds itself in a pre-bankruptcy situation as the central bank has increased the discount applied to purchased gold from fractions of a percent to 15%, a change that destroys profitability. The strengthening of the ruble, itself an artificial product of capital controls, and the forced conversion of export earnings has added losses of up to 35% to an industry already struggling to survive. Neighboring Kazakhstan, once a reliable buyer of Ural gold, now refuses to purchase Russian precious metals. Other Asian countries like Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan remain technically open to trade, but lack the financial capacity to absorb significant quantities. The price of gold in ruble terms has dropped by nearly a third over the past 2 years, from 142,000 rubles per troy ounce at the beginning of 2021 to just 134,000 by early this year. For an industry where margins have always been tight, this decline represents an existential threat. Banks now apply a 20% discount when purchasing gold from producers, while the actual cost of extraction at mines like Berezovsky runs to approximately 2,000 rubles per gram. The arithmetic is simple and devastating. Producers are losing money on every gram they sell, and they cannot afford to stop selling because they must meet production quotas to maintain their licenses. The tax burden on the industry increased 3.5 times between 2020 and 2022 alone, and while regional authorities provide some assistance, it covers only about 30% of the costs that might keep mines operational. The Union of Gold Producers of the Urals warns that this risky situation is typical for all companies operating in the market, and without state intervention, a wave of bankruptcies will sweep through the industry. The depletion of gold reserves and the crisis in gold mining are symptoms of a broader economic transformation that has left Russia increasingly dependent on whatever resources can still be extracted and sold, while the foundations of future prosperity crumble. The energy sector, traditionally the engine of Russian economic growth, faces its own existential challenges as European markets close permanently and Asian buyers demand discounts that erode profitability. The shadow fleet of aging tankers assembled to evade sanctions represents a massive investment in maintaining access to markets, but it is investment that yields no long-term benefit and carries enormous environmental and financial risks. The loss of technology transfers, the emigration of skilled workers, and the systematic diversion of resources to military production ensure that even if the war ended tomorrow, Russia would face years or decades of economic stagnation and decline. The demographic dimension of this crisis compounds every other challenge. The United Kingdom Defense Intelligence, drawing on open sources and official Russian statements, has documented the accelerating collapse of Russia's population base. President Putin himself acknowledged in December that measures already taken in demographic development are insufficient, that negative tendencies persist, and that birth rates continue to decline. This admission, remarkable for its candor, reflects a reality that the Kremlin can no longer conceal. Approximately 1.3 million Russians have emigrated since the full-scale invasion began in 2022, and crucially, these are not random cross-sections of the population but disproportionately younger, better educated, and more professionally skilled citizens. The brain drain that Russia suffered in the 1990s, devastating as it was, pales in comparison to the current exodus, which removes precisely the people Russia needs to build any kind of post-war future. The war itself adds a horrific toll to this demographic catastrophe. Military casualties, estimated by Ukrainian sources at more than 1,240,000 killed and wounded, fall overwhelmingly on young men in their 20s and 30s, the same cohort that would otherwise be forming families and producing the next generation of Russians. The gender imbalance created by these losses will persist for decades, leaving communities across Russia with shortages of marriageable men and all the social consequences that entails. The birth rate, already below replacement level before the invasion, has fallen further as young people postpone family formation in an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. The Ukraine Foreign Intelligence Service predicts that by 2040, Russia could become a society dominated by elderly women, a demographic structure that cannot sustain economic growth or maintain social services. The labor market consequences of this demographic collapse are already visible and will worsen dramatically in coming years. Russia currently faces a shortage of approximately 2.6 million workers, a deficit that the labor minister estimates could surpass 11 million by 2030. This is not a problem that can be solved by calling on Russians to have more children, as Putin has done, urging citizens to follow what he described as Caucasus traditions of early marriage and large families. The children born today will not enter the labor force for 2 decades, and Russia needs workers now to keep its economy functioning. The Kremlin's solution, pursued with increasing urgency even as it contradicts the regime's nationalist rhetoric, is to import foreign labor on a massive scale. The numbers are staggering. Approximately 14 million foreign workers are currently in Russia, with 10.5 million coming from Central Asian countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. These workers form the backbone of Russia's economy, performing essential labor in construction, transportation, retail, and services that Russians themselves are increasingly unwilling or unavailable to perform. But their presence creates a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Kremlin's political strategy. The same regime that stokes anti-migrant sentiment, that passes laws restricting migrant rights, that allows neo-Nazi groups to attack foreigners with impunity, depends absolutely on the labor of those it vilifies. The latest migration policy, signed by Putin in October 2025, embodies this contradiction. It imposes strict controls on migrant workers, requiring them to register in a government-run app that tracks their movements in real time, barring their children from schools unless they speak Russian, and restricting them to specific job categories. Nearly 30 laws restricting migrant rights have been passed since 2024 alone, and in 2025, 87% of migrant children were denied enrollment in Russian schools. Yet even as the Kremlin feeds the nationalist sentiment that demands these restrictions, it continues to negotiate new labor agreements with countries across Asia and Africa to secure the workers its economy cannot survive without. The scale of this recruitment effort is remarkable. Russia is actively negotiating to bring workers from Afghanistan, with Kabul promising young, qualified, and professional labor in exchange for expanded air links and political normalization. These negotiations follow Russia's decision to remove the Taliban-led government from its terrorist list and become the first country to officially recognize the Islamic Emirate, a move that now pays dividends in the form of labor cooperation. From India, at least 40,000 additional workers are expected to arrive in 2026, joining the 70,000 to 80,000 Indian citizens already working in Russia by the end of 2025. Work permits issued to Indians have increased from about 8,000 in 2022 to over 70,000 last year, and a formal labor mobility agreement signed in December will streamline the arrival of tens of thousands more. Russian companies are preparing to recruit workers from Nepal, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, adding new sources of labor to the Central Asian pool that already dominates the foreign workforce. Most controversially, North Korean laborers are already deployed in Russia, working in construction and, most significantly, in drone production facilities, where they assemble Shahed and Jiran-type long-range attack drones used in strikes against Ukrainian cities. More than 12,000 North Korean workers are expected to staff these facilities in Tatarstan's Special Economic Zone, a direct transfer of labor from one pariah state to another in support of the war effort. From Africa, workers are being recruited for the same drone factories, with an estimated 200 African women already employed alongside Russian vocational students. Reports of their deployment have prompted formal inquiries from human rights organizations, but the recruitment continues. The political implications of these developments are profound and dangerous. The Kremlin has constructed a system of rule based on nationalist rhetoric, on the promise of restoring Russian greatness, on the exclusion and vilification of outsiders. Yet the functioning of the Russian economy, and by extension the Russian state, depends on the labor of those outsiders. This contradiction creates a vulnerability that could be exploited by any political force willing to challenge the regime's hypocrisy. When Russian workers see their jobs filled by migrants, when Russian communities see their cultural character changing, when Russian nationalists see the state they support importing the very people they despise, the potential for social explosion grows. The protests that have begun to emerge, small and isolated as they are, suggest that the patience of ordinary Russians is wearing thin. In Omsk, the road blockade by residents demanding heat was a rare public expression of anger, quickly suppressed but significant as a harbinger. In Murmansk, the flood of angry comments on the governor's Telegram account after the blackout represented a level of public criticism that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Violetta Grudina, who lived in the region her entire life until fleeing in 2022, said she had never seen locals so livid with the authorities. The anger is directed not at abstract enemies or foreign adversaries, but at the specific officials and institutions that have failed to provide the basic necessities of survival. The repression that follows any expression of discontent ensures that this anger remains largely private, expressed in kitchens and encrypted messaging apps, rather than in public squares. Yevgeny Stupin, a former Moscow City Assembly member now living in exile, notes that the Kremlin's suppression of any expressions of discontent, particularly those connected to opposition to the war, has spooked people into submission. The protesters in Omsk who blocked the road to demand heat were fined for illegal gathering, a reminder that the state will punish even non-political expressions of grievance when they challenge its authority. The message is clear: you may freeze, but you may not complain. Yet fear has its limits as a tool of social control. The infrastructure failures that are now endemic across Russia are not abstract statistics reported in state media. They are lived realities experienced by millions of people in their own homes, with their own children, in the coldest months of the year. A person who has spent 5 days without heat in a Russian winter, who has watched their pipes burst and their apartment flood, who has sent their children to school in the dark because there is no alternative, does not need independent media to tell them that something has gone terribly wrong. They know it in their bones, quite literally, and that knowledge cannot be erased by propaganda. The international community watches these developments with a mixture of concern and calculation. The spectacle of a nuclear-armed power unable to provide heat and electricity to its own citizens during winter raises obvious questions about its capacity to project power or maintain stability. The economic indicators, the depletion of gold reserves, the collapse of mining industries, the desperate recruitment of foreign labor, all point to a country in fundamental decline. Yet, this decline also creates dangers. A Russia that cannot keep its own people warm may be a Russia that takes greater risks abroad, seeking victories or distractions that might divert attention from domestic failures. The Kremlin's pattern of behavior, from the annexation of Crimea to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has consistently involved the use of external aggression to compensate for internal weakness. A regime facing its greatest internal crisis in decades may be more dangerous, not less. The 380,000 Russians who have been left without heat and electricity this winter are not statistics. They are citizens of a country that has chosen to spend its resources on war rather than welfare. They are the elderly women in Murmansk going to bed in their winter coats because the radiators are cold. They are the parents in Omsk trying to keep their children warm without heat for 2 weeks, while authorities debate who should pay for repairs. They are the residents of Severomorsk, walking through pitch-black streets past the darkened headquarters of a fleet that cannot protect them from the cold. They are the miners in the Urals watching their livelihoods disappear as the gold they extract becomes worthless. They are the workers in drone factories alongside North Korean laborers, building weapons for a war that has already consumed their country's future. The question that hangs over this winter of discontent is whether the Russian people will continue to accept these conditions in silence, or whether the accumulated grievances will eventually find expression in ways that the state cannot suppress. The infrastructure crisis, the economic collapse, the demographic catastrophe, the labor shortage, the depletion of national wealth, all of these are connected to the war in Ukraine, and all of them are becoming impossible to ignore. The Kremlin can blame the weather, blame the Soviet legacy, blame Western sanctions, blame anyone and anything except its own decisions. But the people who are cold, who are hungry, who are watching their children leave and their communities die, know the truth. And that knowledge, once it spreads beyond the private sphere, will be impossible to contain. The second month of 2026 has brought no relief to the frozen cities of Russia's north, as the infrastructure crisis that began with the Murmansk blackout has spread like a contagion through the utility systems of a country that has spent its national wealth on war rather than maintenance. In the Komi Republic, south of the already devastated Murmansk region, entire villages have been without central heating for weeks, their residents burning furniture and dismantling wooden structures to survive temperatures that regularly drop below -30 degrees Celsius. The authorities, when they respond at all, offer promises of repairs that never materialize and temporary shelters that cannot accommodate all those in need. The 380,000 figure, already staggering, now appears to be a significant undercount, as new outages are reported daily from regions that lack the media presence to bring their suffering to national attention. The Russian state, which has devoted trillions of rubles to the conquest of Ukrainian territory, has proven unable or unwilling to ensure that its own citizens can survive the winter in their own homes. The human cost of this failure is not measured solely in discomfort or inconvenience. In the Vologda region, southeast of St. Petersburg, at least 13 people died in January when a boiler house failed and temperatures in their apartment building plunged to levels that made hypothermia inevitable. The official investigation, when it was announced, focused on criminal negligence by local officials rather than the systemic underfunding and neglect that made such failures predictable and perhaps inevitable. In the Orenburg region, near the border with Kazakhstan, a family of 5 was found dead in their home after a power outage disabled their heating system during a cold snap that saw temperatures drop to -40 degrees. The father, a veteran of the war in Ukraine who had returned home with severe injuries just months earlier, had survived the front lines only to freeze to death in his own bed. Stories like these, when they reach national attention at all, are presented as isolated tragedies rather than symptoms of a systemic collapse, but the families who experience them know the truth. The emigration that began as a trickle of dissidents and professionals in 2022 has now become a flood of ordinary Russians seeking any escape from a country that can no longer guarantee their safety or their future. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees estimates that more than 1.3 million Russians have left the country since the full-scale invasion began, but this figure captures only those who have formally sought asylum or registered as residents elsewhere. The true number, counting those who have left on tourist visas and simply never returned, those who have used family connections to establish residence abroad, those who have found work through informal channels and remain in legal gray areas, is almost certainly much higher. The Russian economy, already starved of workers, is losing its most productive citizens at an accelerating rate, and no amount of recruitment from Central Asia or North Korea can replace the skills, education, and entrepreneurial energy that depart with each emigrant. The destinations of these emigrants tell their own story about the future Russia is losing. Georgia, which absorbed hundreds of thousands of Russians in the months after the invasion, now hosts a permanent expatriate community of skilled professionals who have established businesses, founded schools, and integrated into local society. The irony is not lost on Georgians, who remember Russian occupation of their own territory in 2008, but the economic benefits of this influx have softened historical grievances. Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Turkey have similarly become homes to Russian communities that show no signs of returning. The emigration is not temporary, not a waiting game until conditions improve, but a permanent transfer of human capital from a declining state to neighbors and competitors who will reap the benefits of Russian education and training for decades to come. The profile of those leaving has shifted dramatically over the 4 years of full-scale war. The first wave, in 2022, consisted primarily of political activists, journalists, and tech workers who faced immediate threats from the regime's crackdown on dissent. These were people with the resources and connections to leave quickly, and their departure, while damaging, affected relatively narrow segments of Russian society. The current wave is different. It includes doctors and nurses who cannot practice their profession under conditions of wartime scarcity, teachers who refuse to instruct children in the propaganda that now passes for education, engineers who see no future in an economy dedicated to weapons production, and ordinary families who have simply decided that any future abroad is better than no future at home. The cumulative effect of this loss is the hollowing out of the professional and middle classes that might otherwise form the foundation of any post-war recovery. The social consequences of this exodus are visible in every community that has lost its young, its educated, its ambitious. Apartment blocks in major cities stand half-empty as their residents depart for Tbilisi, Yerevan, or Istanbul. Schools struggle to find teachers willing to remain. Hospitals operate with skeleton crews as nurses and doctors join the emigration. The small businesses that once provided services and employment close their doors as their owners seek safer environments for their families and their capital. The fabric of Russian society, already stretched thin by decades of demographic decline and economic stagnation, is being torn apart by the departure of those who might have repaired it. The protests that have begun to emerge, while still small and isolated by historical standards, represent a significant shift in the political landscape. The road blockade in Omsk, the angry comments on the Murmansk governor's Telegram account, the scattered demonstrations in provincial cities where residents demand heat and electricity rather than political change, all suggest a population that is losing its fear faster than the state can adapt its methods of control. These are not the organized political protests of 2011 and 2012, when tens of thousands filled Moscow's streets demanding fair elections. They are more spontaneous, more local, more focused on immediate material grievances than abstract political demands, but they are also more dangerous for the regime precisely because they are not political. A protest that demands democracy can be dismissed as the work of foreign agents and opposition provocateurs. A protest that demands heat, that consists of ordinary people blocking a road because their children are cold, cannot be dismissed so easily. The Kremlin's response to these emerging protests has been characteristic of a regime that has learned to manage dissent through a combination of repression and distraction. The protesters in Omsk were fined, not arrested, a calibrated response designed to discourage imitation without creating martyrs. The anger on social media is monitored but not directly suppressed, as long as it remains focused on local officials rather than national leaders. The state media, when it covers the infrastructure failures at all, presents them as isolated incidents caused by weather or Soviet-era neglect, never connecting them to the wartime spending that has consumed the resources that might have prevented them. The strategy is to contain, to isolate, to prevent the spread of grievance from one community to another, and so far it has worked. But the strategy has limits that are becoming visible as the winter continues and the failures accumulate. Each new blackout, each new heating failure, each new death from hypothermia adds to the reservoir of anger that the regime must somehow manage. The people who are cold today are the same people who were told that Russia was becoming great again, that the sacrifices of war would be rewarded with prosperity and respect, that the West was collapsing while Russia rose. Instead, they find themselves freezing in the dark while their government spends billions on weapons and their president appears on television to promise victory that never comes. The gap between promise and reality, always present in authoritarian systems, has become a chasm that propaganda cannot bridge. The economic dimension of this crisis extends far beyond the immediate suffering of those without heat. The gold mining industry, concentrated in the Urals and Siberia, faces collapse as the combination of falling prices, increased taxes, and closed markets destroys profitability. The Berezovsky mine, which has operated continuously since the 18th century, now faces bankruptcy, and with it, the communities that depend on it for employment and survival. The loss of these mines means more than just economic contraction. It means the destruction of entire towns, the forced migration of thousands of workers and their families, the abandonment of infrastructure that took generations to build. The gold that once flowed from Russian mines to global markets now remains in the ground, inaccessible and useless, while the miners who might have extracted it join the ranks of the unemployed and the desperate. The depletion of Russia's gold reserves, from 560 tons to approximately 160 tons since 2022, represents a strategic vulnerability that extends far beyond the economic sphere. Gold reserves are not just assets, they are confidence, a guarantee that the currency has value, a cushion against financial shocks, a resource that can be deployed in moments of crisis. Russia has burned through 400 tons of this cushion in just 4 years, and the pace of depletion shows no signs of slowing. If the war continues, if sanctions remain in place, if the economy continues to contract, the remaining gold will be consumed as well, leaving Russia with nothing to back its currency and nothing to fall back on when the next crisis arrives. The labor crisis, already acute, is becoming existential. The shortage of approximately 2.6 million workers that the government acknowledges is almost certainly an undercount, as it does not fully account for the emigration of skilled professionals or the mobilization of workers into the military. The Russian economy cannot function without workers, and the workers it has are increasingly concentrated in defense industries that produce nothing of value for civilian consumption. The result is a bizarre economic landscape in which factories operate at full capacity producing weapons while stores run short of basic goods, in which wages rise in military industries while living standards fall everywhere else, in which the state pours money into the war while the infrastructure that supports civilian life crumbles. The recruitment of foreign labor, massive as it is, cannot solve this crisis. The 14 million foreign workers currently in Russia perform essential functions, but they are concentrated in low-skilled occupations that Russian workers have abandoned, rather than the high-skilled professions that Russia has lost to emigration. The doctors, engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs who have left cannot be replaced by migrants from Central Asia or North Korea, no matter how many arrive. The knowledge economy that Russia might have built, the technological innovation that might have diversified its resource-dependent base, the creative industries that might have given its young people reason to stay, all of these require precisely the people who are leaving and cannot be replaced by those who are arriving. The demographic catastrophe that underlies all of these crises continues to worsen. The birth rate, already among the lowest in the world, has fallen further as young people postpone family formation in an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. The death rate, elevated by the health crises of the post-Soviet transition, has been pushed higher by war deaths and the indirect consequences of economic stress. The population, already shrinking before the invasion, is now contracting at an accelerating rate that demographic projections suggest will reach catastrophic proportions by 2040. The Ukraine Foreign Intelligence Service's prediction of a Russia dominated by elderly women is not alarmist speculation, but the logical conclusion of trends that are already well established. The political implications of this demographic collapse extend far beyond the purely statistical. A society with few young people is a society with little dynamism, little innovation, little capacity for change. A society with a surplus of elderly women is a society that will prioritize stability and security over everything else, a society that may accept any condition rather than risk disruption. The Kremlin, which has always understood that an apathetic population is easier to control than an engaged one, may view these demographic trends with a certain cynical satisfaction. But the satisfaction will be short-lived, because an aging population also means a shrinking tax base, a growing burden of pension and healthcare costs, and an economy that cannot generate the growth necessary to sustain itself. The international reactions to Russia's internal collapse have been muted but significant. Western governments, focused on supporting Ukraine and managing the immediate consequences of the war, have been reluctant to comment publicly on Russia's domestic difficulties, fearing that any expression of satisfaction might be used by the Kremlin to rally nationalist sentiment. Behind the scenes, however, intelligence agencies are monitoring the situation closely, preparing for a range of contingencies that include everything from a sudden end to the war to a complete collapse of the Russian state. The planning that has gone into managing a post-war Ukraine is now being matched by planning for a post-Putin Russia, even as officials acknowledge that the uncertainties involved make any detailed preparation almost impossible. China's response has been particularly significant, as Beijing watches its northern neighbors decline with a mixture of concern and calculation. The economic relationship that has kept Russia afloat, with China purchasing discounted energy and providing essential goods, remains in place, but its terms are shifting. China now demands even steeper discounts for Russian oil and gas, exploiting Moscow's desperation to secure better terms for itself. The labor agreements that bring Chinese workers to Russia, while presented as mutually beneficial, actually represent a transfer of economic power from a declining state to a rising one. China is positioning itself to be the dominant partner in any post-war relationship, and every month of continued Russian decline strengthens its bargaining position. The potential for a Russian collapse to trigger wider instability is a growing concern among strategists and policymakers. A Russia that cannot control its own territory, that cannot provide for its own citizens, that cannot maintain its nuclear arsenal or secure its borders, would be a source of danger far beyond its immediate neighborhood. The risk of nuclear proliferation, as weapons and materials become vulnerable to theft or sale, is perhaps the most alarming scenario, but it is far from the only one. Mass refugee flows, regional conflicts sparked by the power vacuum, criminal networks exploiting the chaos, all of these are possibilities that planners must consider as they watch Russia's internal situation deteriorate. The Ukrainian perspective on Russia's collapse is necessarily complex. For a nation that has suffered invasion, occupation, and atrocities, the prospect of the enemy's disintegration might seem like justice, like the natural consequence of aggression. But Ukrainian leaders understand that a chaotic Russia is not necessarily a safe Russia, that the end of the war does not guarantee the end of danger, that the collapse of the Russian state could create new threats even as it removes old ones. The Ukrainian government's official position, support for a Ukrainian victory that leads to a negotiated settlement and a stable post-war order, reflects this understanding. The goal is not to watch Russia burn, but to secure Ukraine's future, and that future depends on the existence of a Russia that is capable of making and keeping agreements. The Russian people, isolated from the world and fed a diet of lies about their country's situation, face a future that grows darker with each passing month. The infrastructure failures that have left hundreds of thousands without heat are not anomalies. They are previews of what is to come, as the cumulative neglect of decades combines with the overwhelming demands of war to produce a cascade of failures that will affect every aspect of daily life. The economic collapse that has depleted gold reserves and destroyed industries is not a temporary downturn. It is the permanent transformation of a country that has chosen war over development and is now paying the price. The demographic catastrophe that has emptied communities and starved the labor force is not a cyclical phenomenon. It is the structural reality of a nation that has lost its future. The protests that have begun to emerge, small and isolated as they are, suggest that the Russian people may not accept this future passively forever. The woman in Murmansk who told reporters she had never seen locals so angry, the residents of Omsk who blocked a road with their cars, the flood of critical comments on official Telegram accounts, all of these are signs that the patience that has characterized Russian society for decades may be wearing thin. The regime's ability to suppress dissent, formidable as it is, depends on the willingness of the population to accept its authority. When that willingness erodes, when fear is overcome by desperation, when the choice becomes between freezing in silence and protesting in danger, the calculus changes. The winter of 2026 will end eventually, as all winters do. The snow will melt, the temperatures will rise, and the immediate crisis of cold and darkness will recede, but the underlying conditions that produce this crisis will remain. The pipes that burst this winter will not be replaced by spring, they will be patched temporarily and left to fail again next year. The pylons that collapsed will be restored with whatever materials are available, not with the modern infrastructure that might prevent future failures. The mines that closed will not reopen, the workers who left will not return, the gold that was sold will not be recovered. The damage done this winter is permanent, and it will compound with the damage done next winter, and the winter after that, until the accumulated failures become impossible to manage. The 380,000 Russians who experienced this winter without heat are not the last. They are the first, the leading edge of a wave of suffering that will spread across the country as the infrastructure collapses, as the economy contracts, as the state's capacity to provide even the most basic services diminishes. The residents of Murmansk who huddled in libraries and emergency tents this January will remember that experience for the rest of their lives. They will remember that their government, which had money for tanks and missiles and payments to soldiers' families, did not have money to keep their radiators warm. They will remember that their president, who appears on television promising victory and greatness, did not appear in their frozen city to explain why they had no heat, and that memory, once it spreads and multiplies across the vast expanse of Russia, will become a political force that no amount of propaganda can contain. The international community watches and waits, uncertain how to respond to a crisis that is simultaneously a humanitarian tragedy, a strategic opportunity, and a source of unprecedented danger. The instinct to help, to offer assistance to those suffering from cold and deprivation, conflicts with the reality that any aid would flow through a regime that has demonstrated its willingness to prioritize war over welfare. The desire to see the aggressor weakened, to witness the consequences of imperial overreach, conflicts with the knowledge that a collapsing Russia threatens global stability. The hope that the Russian people will eventually hold their leaders accountable conflicts with the evidence that repression remains effective and opposition remains suppressed. The only certainty is that the Russia emerging from this winter is not the Russia that entered it. The losses, human and material and psychological, are permanent. The trajectory, downward into further decline, is established. The questions that remain, how far the fall will go, how much suffering will be endured, how the international community will respond, cannot yet be answered. What can be said with confidence is that the 380,000 Russians who lost heat this winter, the 13 who died in Vologda, the family of 5 in Orenburg, the miners facing bankruptcy in the Urals, the emigrants building new lives abroad, are all part of a transformation that will define Russia for generations. The country that emerges from this crisis, whatever form it takes, will be fundamentally different from the one that entered it. And that difference, like the cold itself, will be felt by everyone.